What actually happens when a war shifts away from missiles and airstrikes and instead goes straight after bank accounts, shipping lanes, and internet connections? We usually look to the skies for signs of conflict, waiting for those big breaking news headlines. But right now, one of the absolutely most consequential conflicts on the planet is happening right in front of us, on spreadsheets and shipping manifests. So in this explainer, we're going to unpack the multi-layered economic blockade that's quietly crippling the Iranian regime. It's basically a silent siege, and it has massive, massive implications for global energy markets, trade, and, honestly, international security.
All right, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to cover the unseen war, retreat of the proxies, the economic stranglehold, starving the machine, the price of censorship, and finally, the ultimate threat.
So let's jump right into part one, the unseen war, a shifting battlefield.
While everyone's attention gets hijacked by visible political events and sudden flashes of violence, there's this massive, unseen economic siege quietly accelerating in the background. Traditionally, we think of conflict as kinetic military action, right? Airstrikes, troop movements, stuff blowing up. But the modern battlefield has shifted heavily toward economic sieges and blockades. We're looking at a scenario where the weapons aren't explosives, they're severed financial ties, they're blocked shipping routes. It is literally a method of warfare designed to drain an adversary's resources so completely that their physical military just becomes useless.
And there's a quote that perfectly captures the sheer intensity of what we're looking at here. Miad Malaki, who's a fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and a former US Treasury official, recently described the current strategy like this. This is Trump administration maximum pressure campaign in the first term on a steroid. The source material points out that the whole goal here is to leverage unparalleled economic isolation to force the Iranian regime into a state of structural collapse.
Moving on to Section 2, Retreat of the Proxies, a shrinking footprint. Let's look at how this intense economic pressure is directly dismantling Iran's global reach, because the immediate real-world consequence of an empty bank account is a shrinking global footprint. For decades, the sources note that Iran's playbook has been to build proxy networks right on the borders of its adversaries. But if we look at the current status across the board, it's wild. Hezbollah and Hamas, significantly degraded. The Houthis down in Yemen, they're increasingly distant and basically unresponsive to Tehran's directives. And maybe most surprising of all, Venezuela? Iran was actually working with the Maduro regime to build drone manufacturing sites right in the Americas, literally setting up shop in the US's backyard. But thanks to recent geopolitical shifts and massive economic constraints, those ties have been completely cut, and that manufacturing has ground to a halt. Their footprint is shrinking, and it's shrinking fast.
All right, Part 3, the economic stranglehold, the Strait of Hormuz.
To really understand why that footprint is shrinking, we've got to look at the primary choke point of their entire economy. 90 to 96%, according to the data in our sources. That is the staggering percentage of Iran's economy that relies entirely on trade passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Because of external blockades, combined ironically enough with the regime's own disruptive actions in the strait, this vital artery has been practically paralyzed. And think about it. When you choke off up to 96% of a nation's trade route, the economic fallout isn't just some slow decline. It's an immediate, absolute free fall. Let's trace a quick timeline that shows exactly how fast this free fall happens. On April 12th, analysts noted that Iran had only 13 days of onshore oil storage capacity remaining. The oil just wasn't moving. Fast forward less than 2 weeks to April 25th, and the situation had become so desperate that the regime was forced to recommission old, retired oil tankers. And they didn't bring these ships back to transport oil to buyers. No, they brought them back simply as floating dumpsters to store the unsold oil, because they literally had nowhere else to put it. Which brings us to Section 4, Starving the Machine, where the money goes. So what actually happens when the oil stops flowing? Let's break down why this specific blockade is successfully crippling the regime's military operations. The key to the whole puzzle lies in how the revenue is divided. Notice that 33% slice? 1 out of every 3 barrels of exported oil goes directly to fund the armed forces, including the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC. They don't just get a standard budget from the government, they're physically handed a third of the oil to sell on the global market themselves. That's how they generate the foreign currency they need to fund their operations and pay their proxies.
Which brings us to a super simple but incredibly powerful equation. No oil exports equals no proxy fighter salaries. The blockades aren't just hurting the general economy. They are directly starving the regime's terror infrastructure. If the IRGC can't move their 33% of the oil out of the Strait of Hormuz, they simply don't get paid. And if they don't get paid, those proxy networks we looked at earlier, from the Middle East all the way to South America, they completely wither away.
Section 5. The price of censorship. A self-inflicted wound.
But here's the thing. The pressure isn't just coming from the outside. The regime is actually inflicting massive economic damage upon itself out of sheer panic, catching itself in this devastating internal trap. Their economy has practically collapsed from the blockades. Because of that, they are absolutely desperate for an economic relief deal. But here's the catch. To get that deal, they'd likely have to abandon their nuclear program, which is something they've spent hundreds of billions of dollars building. If they surrender that program, the analysis suggests they risk losing all legitimacy with their core base of supporters, which sources estimate makes up only 10 to 15% of the country. So they're completely paralyzed. They need a deal to survive economically, but signing that deal might destroy them politically. So what do? They're banking on Western political cycles, just hoping domestic pressure in the US forces an end to the siege before they collapse entirely. But honestly, here's the most fascinating part of this entire explainer. Despite facing this massive, totally unprecedented external blockade, the regime's biggest fear isn't actually an external enemy. It's not a foreign military at all. To understand what they are truly terrified of, just look at this number: $35 to $50 million. That is the staggering amount of money the Iranian economy loses every single day. But it's not lost to foreign sanctions. It's lost because of government-mandated internet shutdowns.
Let's be super clear about what this actually means. Right in the middle of an economic collapse, where trade is literally their only lifeline, the regime is purposefully shutting off the internet, the very backbone of modern commerce. Why? Because they are absolutely terrified that if their citizens can communicate, if they can organize on social media, they're gonna rise up. They are literally willing to strangle their own remaining trade, burning up to $50 million a day just to keep their own people blind and disconnected. It's wild.
And that brings us to Section 6, the ultimate threat, the Iranian people. This is the final and really the most crucial piece of the puzzle. The true existential threat to the Islamic Republic is the internal resistance. The source material emphasizes that the Iranian people are a highly talented, modern, and notably pro-West populace who are basically currently living as hostages in their own country. Remember, even before this intense economic blockade weakened the regime, 40,000 citizens were willing to sacrifice their lives protesting in the streets. But now those citizens are facing a regime that has been completely stripped of its foreign proxy power, cut off from its oil wealth, and is bleeding millions of dollars a day in a desperate bid to censor them. The external pressure hasn't just hurt the regime, it has leveled the playing field for the people.
So, we have to ask ourselves as we wrap up this explainer, as this silent siege of external economic pressure accelerates the regime's internal collapse, will their ultimate downfall come from a foreign military strike, or will the final blow be delivered from within, by the very citizens they are spending millions of dollars a day trying to silence? Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive. Keep looking beyond the headlines, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.